This system did not fail because it was immoral or inefficient. It failed because it was optimized for coordination at a scale that eventually exceeded its own capacity to govern. Before we talk about empires as political entities or moral projects, we need to understand what they actually were. At a structural level, an empire is a coordination system. It is a method for organizing resources, information, authority, and decision-making across distances that would otherwise be impossible to manage. The British Empire, at its peak, was the largest coordination system ever attempted by a pre-digital society. It governed roughly 1/4 of the world's population and spanned time zones, climates, legal traditions, languages, and economies that had no natural reason to interact. What made the British Empire remarkable was not ideology, morality, or destiny. It was scale. And scale introduces a problem that no system can escape. Coordination costs rise faster than coordination capacity. For a period of time, the system worked. Not because it was benevolent, not because it was uniquely enlightened. It worked because Britain built institutional mechanisms that temporarily overcame the fundamental problem of distance. This is not a story about good and evil. It is a story about structure, incentives, and what happens when coordination becomes more expensive than the value it produces. At the most basic level, long-distance coordination requires predictability. Moving goods from India to Britain in the 18th century required more than ships. It required reliable routes, protected harbors, enforceable contracts that remained valid across months of travel time, insurance markets capable of pricing uncertainty, and legal systems that merchants in Calcutta and London both recognized as legitimate. Without these mechanisms, long-distance trade collapses under its own risk. The British Empire constructed this infrastructure because it had to. The Royal Navy did more than fight wars. It suppressed piracy, enforced navigation rules, charted coastlines, standardized maritime law, and stabilized critical choke points such as the Cape of Good Hope, the Straits of Malacca, and later the Suez Canal. This created predictability. Even merchants who were not British benefited. Transaction costs fell. Insurance premiums declined. Trade volumes increased. Coordination generated surplus. But naval dominance alone cannot coordinate an empire. Trade at scale also requires administration, finance, and trust. Britain developed standardized legal frameworks based on common law, courts that resolved disputes locally, and bureaucratic procedures that allowed decisions to be made without waiting months for approval from London. This work was not dramatic. It was procedural and repetitive. But it mattered. Every dispute resolved locally reduced information load at the center. Every standardized regulation reduced cognitive overhead for merchants planning long-term investments. Alongside legal infrastructure, the empire relied on financial coordination. London became the center of imperial finance. British banks, insurers, and bond markets financed railways, ports, plantations, and administrative systems across the empire. Institutions like Lloyd's of London priced risk across oceans. Sterling functioned as a global settlement currency. This financial layer allowed the empire to move capital as efficiently as it moved goods. At this stage, the empire functioned as an efficiency engine. It reduced friction between distant regions and transformed fragmented markets into a single operational space. But efficiency at scale introduces a dependency: information flow. Coordination requires feedback. And in a pre-digital world, feedback traveled slowly. In the late 18th century, a message from London to India could take 6 months. Decisions were always based on outdated information. This forced a structural choice. Either authority had to be delegated to local officials, or the system would stagnate. Britain chose delegation. Governors, district officers, and company administrators were granted broad discretionary power. They interpreted laws, negotiated treaties, collected taxes, and responded to crises without real-time oversight. This allowed the system to function, but it introduced misalignment. Local decisions optimized for local conditions. Central expectations optimized for imperial coherence. The introduction of the telegraph in the 19th century appeared to solve this problem. Messages that once took months now traveled in hours. But faster communication did not eliminate friction. It changed its form. The center could now monitor local decisions more closely. It could override them. It could demand justification after the fact. Local administrators now faced contradictory incentives. They still had to act decisively in emergencies, but they were judged by distant superiors with partial information and retrospective clarity. As oversight increased, risk tolerance declined. Decision-making slowed. Administrators became cautious. The system grew heavier. Faster communication increased central control, but reduced local adaptability. Coordination costs rose. Empires do not collapse because they run out of resources. They collapse because the cost of governing exceeds the surplus extracted. Early British rule relied heavily on existing institutions. A relatively small number of officials governed through local elites, traditional tax systems, and established courts. Administrative overhead was low. Surplus remained high. As the empire expanded, this model broke down. New territories lacked compatible institutions. Resistance movements required surveillance. Labor unrest required policing. Political demands required bureaucratic processing. Each response added personnel, procedures, reporting requirements, and layers of oversight. Administrative density increased faster than revenue. By the early 20th century, Britain employed hundreds of thousands of administrators, soldiers, and civil servants across its empire. Maintaining order in India, Ireland, Africa, and the Middle East became increasingly expensive. At the same time, global competition intensified. Germany and the United States industrialized rapidly. Britain's relative economic advantage narrowed. The cost of empire rose as its financial base weakened. Alongside economic strain came a legitimacy problem. Large systems do not run on force alone. They require compliance. Britain had built its empire on legalism, property rights, and institutional order. It trained colonial administrators and local elites in these principles. Over time, those principles were turned inward. If the empire governed through law, why was representation denied? If it protected property, why was extraction unilateral? These questions were not revolutionary. They were system-consistent. Suppressing these challenges required force. Force increased cost. Increased cost reduced surplus. Reduced surplus weakened legitimacy further. This feedback loop defines imperial decline. The First World War accelerated this process by exhausting Britain financially and exposing the limits of imperial power. After the Second World War, the system no longer made economic sense. By the mid-20th century, Britain faced a rational choice: escalate indefinitely or withdraw. Withdrawal was cheaper. Decolonization was not a moral awakening. It was a cost-benefit decision. The British Empire was not uniquely immoral or uniquely incompetent. It was a highly sophisticated coordination system that encountered the structural limits of scale. As systems grow, communication costs rise, decision latency increases, and alignment deteriorates. Complexity compounds. At some point, coherence becomes more expensive than expansion is profitable. This pattern is not historical. It is structural. Modern corporations, global institutions, and even digital platforms face the same constraints. The British Empire is a case study in what happens when a system optimizes for reach without accounting for the rising cost of coherence. Scale creates power. Coordination creates limits. And every system, regardless of intent, eventually discovers where those limits lie.